but by their own definition of what a species is, they could all breed and bring forth. So are they really a different species? Because according to their own classification and their own definition of what a species is, it's not. They're not different species. So this is how we view it. This is a chart that I like to do. I show a horse, one of the original, one that was on the ark. They got off. They lost information over time. They went from more homozygous to heterozygous over deep time. The more they've encompassed the world, they basically maxed out the regions where they can diversify, and now they start going down. And we can see the same thing with an armadillo. Are they still armadillos? Yes, they are. Here's a beaver, gigantic, monstrous beaver before the flood. Here they are today, but yet still of the same kind. So according to them, we should have all these different species below here on the ark. That's what makes them mad, is we realize, no, these can bring forth and create more species that diversify, but they stay within their own kind. And that's what they get mad about. They go, well, where's the dividing line? How can you know this? We're going to get into all that. I guarantee it. I just wanted to say that we know that this is more rapid now. We can see these things. We know from our observable evidence that this speciation rate is rapid in plants and in animals and reptiles and birds. You can basically take your pick and go down the list. It doesn't really matter where you look. It's all telling us the exact same thing. And if we can observe it today, I want you to imagine how much more you would be able to observe this in a world that was basically empty after the flood. It was wiped out. There's nothing but plants left. And then animals get off of the ark. And what do? Well, they migrate, they speciate, and fill the earth. Some went north. Elephants that did that became the mammoth. Some went south. They became a whole new species because you don't need the hair. You get the hairless Indian elephant. So we have these great examples and visuals that we see for rapid speciation. And you have to remember, this was not predicted. Darwin predicted that one species of finch should arise once every 3,000 years. That was his prediction. That's what he put in writing. Guess what they found? One new finch species every 3.5 years. You talk about an utter failure of a prediction. You can't get much worse than that. That's literally in the entire realm of predictions. That's on the far spectrum of what they would have ever expected. And
let me point out, remember when you and I had that, we did two debates with Adam Heap. He's a zoologist and a herpetologist, right? And we debated him specifically on the evolutionary model of speciation versus the young earth creation or separate ancestry model of speciation. And I highly recommend people watch those debates, because we get into the predictions from either the young earth creation side or the evolution side. And although we put prediction after prediction, which some of these predictions coming true, which we're going to get into a little bit later when it comes to the young earth creation model of speciation, he resorted to what? Well, we can't make predictions from the evolutionary model because there are too many extinction events, or there are too many variables that we would never be able to make a true prediction that is novel and testable. And we pointed out, well, then your explanation is pseudoscientific. The gold standard of science is to make future testable predictions that are falsifiable. And it's the creationists that are doing it in the realm of speciation rates. And it's fitting perfectly with the flood bottleneck of 4,500 years ago and all species coming from there. And a major, as I said earlier, I'm going to share screen again, okay, is this straw man argument that you see from the evolution, especially the old earth creationists. It's hilarious, okay? You have like reasons to believe, for example, that try and say young earth creationists believe in hyperevolution. But then when you press them and say, do you believe God would have created organisms, and let's say Adam and Eve, genetically homogeneous with no pre-existing DNA diversity? They'll say oftentimes that of course not. When God said, be fruitful and multiply, he didn't mean be fruitful and clone yourself. So even the old earth creationists, like them at Reasons to Believe, will say, yeah, the created heterozygosity model that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve and the created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences makes sense. Well, then, from that starting point, all you need in a single generation is recombination, shuffle up, scramble up those DNA variants, gene conversion, and you will have visible variety in one single generation. My wife and myself alone have 3 million differences in our genetics. And that's why, hypothetically, if we had 1 million kids, every single kid would be genetically different because we have built-in heterozygosity. So the question to the old earth creationists is, why aren't there more species in light of what we know? Why are there so few species? And then they will admit they can't make predictions. Okay, because if they are going to acknowledge this position of design diversity, but then try and say we believe in hyperevolution, the problem is in their model, there's too little species now, right? So the old earth creationists are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The theistic evolutionists at least hold to the overall explanation from the evolutionist side for the origin of genetic diversity. They would, for the most part, I think the scientists at BioLogos would say, yeah, the origin of genetic diversity is the result of mutations over time. So they need millions of years to accumulate enough genetic diversity where that genetic diversity can be used through migration, isolation, recombination, gene conversion, okay? Subpopulations branching off from a greater population where there will eventually be enough genetic distinctiveness where we have a new species. The creation model, those DNA differences are already built in from the start, and they still can't comprehend that. So if the old earth creationists want to hold on to that model, which makes sense scientifically and biblically, they now have the problem, why are there so few species? And they can't answer that. So right here in this article, Does BioLogos Strive for Dialogue? A gigantic difference between YEC and evolution traces to the source of what? Remember, we explained this, of genetic variety we see today. As I published, Nathaniel Jensen's talking, previously and discussed in great depth, which these old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists are obviously not up to date on, or else they would not be repeating the same straw man arguments, okay? Darwinists think all genetic differences are due to mutation. And here's what's funny too, is the evolutionist wants to say that mutations add the novelty necessary for true innovation and true improvements in, let's say, phenotypic complexity, the evolution of higher life forms, even though the type of variation math that you get for mutations, right, is like the type of variation you get in your car when you're parked at the grocery store and unfortunately a grocery cart hits your car and now you got a dent, or the rust spots or scratches. That's the type of variation you get from mutations. Okay, that's why what we see in terms of DNA function and in terms of these variation-inducing genetic elements, we see that the vast majority of beneficial variation is front-loaded. That makes the most sense. That's why the theistic evolutionists don't have a case. And that's what at least the old earth creationists recognize, that mutations are degrading. Mutations do not produce beneficial variation. Okay, mutations create disease. One single point mutation can kill somebody. Then the old earth creationists are stuck between a rock and a hard place because now they have to acknowledge the validity of front-loaded genetic diversity, but now they have to explain, well, why are there so few species? If we're seeing new species and rapid adaptive episodes today, and yet there's only really just thousands of species when there should be far more. So I want to get through this and then I'll hand it over to you, brother. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen says, I have argued that most differences between species are due to shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. So here's another important part. We as creationists look back to the creation event and we look back to the expansion of genetic information, okay? We look back to the creation event and we see a greater ability to diversify, speciate, and adapt. The evolutionists, the theistic evolutionists like Sentinel Apologetics, who could not defend universal common ancestry, through the scientific data. And I challenge him to debate the topic, is all life related through common ancestry? And I think that debate will turn out something similar to my debate with Bill Tavis, but we'll see if he accepts that challenge. So they look back to, okay, the creation event, essentially. Let's say you go back to a single-celled like ancestor billions of years ago. They look back to not the expansion of genetic information like we look to, okay? They look back to the contraction of genetic information because they need to add genetic and phenotypic complexity from a single-celled like ancestor to a multi-celled ancestor to a fish to an amphibian, right? To a reptile, to a mammal, to man. That requires true novelty, increases in complexity. Okay, so two different starting points and therefore two different expectations. And that's why we are winning the battle in terms of the gold standard of science, which is predictions. And we're making predictions on DNA function, and they come true more and more every single day. So Dr. Nathaniel Jensen points out this singular difference in the source of genetic variety has massive consequences for how new species can form and for the limits of speciation. See, we can recognize that as time goes on and more shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity occur, species are going to hit walls where they now have a lesser ability to speciate. Look at a Chihuahua. That's reached a wall, right? There's not much allelic variability there in a Chihuahua. Duff doesn't appear to have read this paper. See, Joel Duff, he's the guy that we're reviewing here. And he's their go-to guy when it comes to speciation and attacking the young Earth creation model. He's got nothing. He's not up to date on the evidence. He can't stand up to young Earth creation predictions. If he has, he's deliberately, notice this, deliberately clouding, dishonestly, the clear and enormous distinctions between YEC and evolution by his shallow descriptions. Returning to Duff's overall point, is there really no evidence for rapid speciation as Duff asserts? The lay-level summaries of the technical papers that I've written on this topic discuss multiple lines of evidence that support the YEC model, everything from Darwin's own writings to modern genetics. Since Duff makes no attempt to interact with this literature, we have no evidence that he's aware of it. And we see this, unfortunately, with people like Sentinel Apologetics, people like Inspiring Philosophy. They're not up to date on the data. They're not making their own predictions. They're not even able to reiterate our own predictions. If you ask them oftentimes, what's the starting point from your model in terms of the origin of genetic diversity, they'll look at you with a blank look on their face. Okay, now there are some theistic evolutionists in the chat now, so hopefully now they finally stop strawmanning the position and finally start putting forth some predictions of their own. Anyways, that's my thoughts for there.